Hello there, we are glad you're tuned to Law Matters, a show that is educative, informative, and offers a legal aid solution to what we face on our day to day lives. Tonight, we're having an interesting discussion concerning the aftermath of the AUC election. Kenya is still reeling from the shock of the loss of opposition leader Raila Odinga, who went for that particular seat but unfortunately could not garner enough votes to clinch that particular slot. We'll be looking into what are the loopholes that were there in that particular election, where did Kenya get it wrong, and are there any implications into the loss of Odinga in that particular election? Remember, you can send in your feedback in terms of your questions and any other comments you may have on this particular show on our social media platforms at KUTV Kenya on Facebook, at KUTV_Kenya on Twitter, and KUTV Kenya on YouTube. My name is Irene Mwangi, but before we debunk this particular topic, let me allow my guest to introduce himself kindly.
Thank you very much for having me. My name is Emmanuel Famba Barasa, an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and a law lecturer as well.
All right.
I teach at the Kenyatta University School of Law, and I also consult on international trade and international law issues.
All right. Thanks so much, Advocate Barasa, for making time for this particular discussion, given that you interact mostly on a day-to-day basis in terms of international law, which, sits well with the discussion that we're having tonight. And the first question would be, what is usually the framework in terms of African Union Commission chairperson slot election, given that the perception out there was that this now was an Eastern African thing? Are there any particular framework that goes to the elections of that particular seat?
So the election of the chairperson, the deputy chairperson, and the commissioners of the AUC are guided by the rules of procedure of the Assembly and the Executive Council. Rule 38 specifically provides for the election of the chairperson. And one of the things that the Executive Council did, I think 5-7 years ago, was to enact rotation in the election of the chairperson, so that Africa is divided into regions: Eastern, Central, Southern, and Northern regions. These regions are supposed to, in this event, nominate a candidate.
Okay.
But the procedure, the rules of procedure do not, and I think they envisage a situation where the region is supposed to have a chat, have some consensus, and produce a candidate. But they do not force that a region has to produce only one candidate for election.
Okay.
And that's why you had the Eastern region, which was the one producing the chairperson in this turn of elections, producing 3 candidates for the same position.
Yeah.
We failed at consensus. We have failed before, so this is not the first time to get consensus on one candidate. But usually what will happen is exactly what happened in this election. You hope that you have 2-3 candidates, and then the bigger man always emerges out of the 3, and then you rally your consensus around him to help them get elected in the position. And sadly, that was not the case of Kenya's candidate, Raila Odinga, in this election.
All right. And it begs the question whereby, given that we are the Eastern African community, which, have the likes of, let's even not look into Madagascar, into Kenya and Djibouti, we are part of the Eastern African community. And therefore, given that we wanted to go for this particular seat, was there not a way of some sort of negotiated democracy for either Kenya or Djibouti to fill the candidate, given that looking into the amount of money and time that was consumed in the campaign period for almost a year to garner that particular slot, was there no way to have negotiated democracy, or is Eastern Africa as a bloc, they haven't really reached that particular threshold in terms of unity?
It appears we have a challenge with that. When the turn was for the South African region, for example, and they were to settle on a candidate, it was very easy for them to second someone from South Africa. And that lady, Zuma, then became, Zuma became the AUC chair. For the East African region, we are these brothers who live together but have not settled, at least in the foundational levels.
in this particular.
Kenya could offer.
Some will have said we needed a more diplomatic, sort of diplomatic-oriented candidate compared to Raila. Does that resonate the same with the continent? Do they see this particular post as one that should be filled with a more diplomatic-oriented candidate? Good evening. We are glad you tuned to Law Matters. I'm sure that is educative. Yangu iko sawa? Hello there. Advocate, you can, chime in on whether Raila whether Raila was best suited for that.
I don't know. Maybe not. But how do we actually even settle on these candidates? It's politics.
It's more politics.
It's politics. And the interest of the
Keep watching Cutting Edge Research at Kenyatta University Television.
Thank you for staying with us. You're watching Law Matters tonight, discussing the issue of the aftermath following the loss of Raila Odinga in the AUC elections. Now, Advocate Barasa, before we went on a break, we were talking about the Eastern African dynamics and how, the rules, the election framework affected that. Now, when it comes to campaigns, we talk about Francophone and Anglophone, countries. And there's been the question, when you look into the analysis, the Francophone countries have an advantage when it comes to numbers. And therefore, even if they will not field a candidate, the perception then is that whoever will vie, they might have an added advantage in terms of choosing whoever will clinch that particular post. Looking into the analysis of the situation, do you think that is the case? And is it really a loophole in terms of the election framework?
I think it's balanced, yeah? So if you think about the procedure in its totality, we have said we want an AU chairperson and we want the position to rotate so that there is a concentration on Francophone countries in a certain part of the continent. But because of that rotation, then it allows more than just the Francophones to have the seat. But I think what I was saying in the previous segment is that who in the eastern region, a region that is not necessarily Francophone, connects to the other side of the continent. And in this case, then I think the Djibouti candidate became more sellable because then he could relate more personally with the individuals on the other side of the continent. In instances where we have Anglophone candidates, there is of course possibility, and that has happened over and over again, that the Francophone countries would vote as a bloc.
Okay.
So wherever the candidate is from Eastern Africa, if they are competing, wherever the Francophone vote will go, most probably that person will become chairperson. And maybe then it is in the interest of the Anglophone, Eastern Africa and other regions in the continent to maybe just propose one candidate. Because then by default they become chairperson without necessarily going through the election. Yeah, because with the structure, if you do not have any candidate, if you just have one candidate, they become chairperson by default. But if you go for a vote, then the voting bloc called up Francophone becomes very important. But I think also the election has more than just that as part of its context. And the other things that I think would inform how countries would vote is regions like SADC, very united region, I think, in this continent. And when they speak, when the institutions in SADC speak, it appears the member countries listen. But more, when you look at Raila as a candidate, you can look at him as the person of Raila Odinga who was running for office with deep experience, political experience in Kenya and through the continent. He has also served as a high representative for infrastructure with the African Union. So he has a good view of the continent. But what other context informs Kenya as the person, as the country which is proposing this candidate? Kenya and its leader are largely viewed as one and the same thing. You would recall that when there was an alliance of M23. It was launched right here in Nairobi.
Yeah.
That I don't think sits well with a capital city like Kinshasa. So even if the diplomats in Kinshasa would want to back an EAC candidate, if you look at it from an interest perspective, then Kenya will not be necessarily the country they would back. For a country like Ethiopia, close as they are to Kenya, or at least the leaders, the Prime Minister and the President in here, they're very close friends. But I think once it comes to the diplomatic table, Djibouti is offering you a port so that you do not fight with another neighbor called Somalia. When it comes to voting for a candidate, where would you go? As a matter of interest, it is very likely that then Djibouti will have your vote. Personal vendetta or friendship aside. Now, Kenya has also been very loud, I would say, on things that they shouldn't speak about. For South Africa, for example, one of the issues they have with Kenya is Kenya's very early on support of Israel, despite the atrocities in Gaza. We might not want to associate this election with that context, but it informs the position, for example, of South Africa. And the South African voice is an important voice in South Africa, in the southern part of the continent, because Kenya brags of being the big player in East Africa. That's what South Africa is down south, right? So the voice of South Africa will carry a lot of weight. And when you look at even the other countries that have come to support the ICJ case, you have a lot of South African support. And you look at it also internationally speaking. Countries like Lesotho and Botswana have been very outspoken for very many things, leave alone continental issues that revolve around the African Union. When they have seen atrocities, they have spoken. So that is one, for example, Botswana is one that values its sovereignty. It's very ready to defend its position, and you would expect a very independent mind and rational thought around issues. And so I think if you look at it in totality, then all this provide the context with which we can see this loss actually happening. Because then you technically have lost the SADC bloc, you have Eastern African region, and the region that you're coming from has 3 candidates. One candidate has a bit of support. It might not be outright, but if you're to think, do I want to support a state where rebels from my own country went and launched their alliance? Maybe not. So if within Eastern Africa you've taken out Djibouti, you've taken out Ethiopia, you've taken out DRC, you're remaining with just a few neighbors here who, as analysts would say regarding the 2017 election of Amina Mohammed, we are not sure if they support us.
It's dicey when it comes to their support. And we'll be getting into the diplomatic blunders that led to Raila Odinga's loss. But before we get into it, do you think Raila is the best candidate that we could have fielded to the continent? Because it was always like Baba to Baba to Africa. But then some will have said, was Baba the best candidate to field?
I don't know what the continent needed. So if the continent needed a politician, then Baba was, as he's called, then the best candidate. But also you must credit the man that he has what I would call sufficient experience in the political space, having dealt with, the 2008 elections here, him being one of the players and making sure that the government was able to transition into a national government of national accord, and his experience with peace and security matters and infrastructure. So if you are to look at the political credentials of Raila Odinga, then he would be a fit candidate for AUC as a chairperson. But there is more, I think, that we miss and we get from the Djibouti candidate. Apart from being a politician, he has been a diplomat. So while Baba has been sending people to do things, he has been the one being sent in those rooms. So he understands the rules of engagement. And I think it speaks to, as a country, we need to maybe think about how do we groom the people we want to take over these positions when time comes. In other countries, you'll find there is a very rigorous process of getting foreign affairs or service officers who then rise through the ranks, either to serve in the UN organizations, system organizations, and therefore when you're bringing them out to pitch them on high executive offices, it's very easy to stab those positions. The Djibouti candidate in this case, for example, this is a man who has been, of course, ambassador largely within Africa. He hasn't moved around past the continent much.
Yeah.
And then he has been a foreign affairs minister for over 15 years, I think. That's a lot of continental experience.
Yeah.
So while you might not, and when you look at how things are done in the AU, of course, the Assembly of Heads of State and Government continues to hold a lot of executive power, but the technical work is done by the Executive Council, which foreign affairs ministers would set. So there's a lot of institutional understanding, in my view, that the Djibouti candidate would bring that maybe our candidate missed. And maybe when you front a pure diplomat, you save him from the other face of the politics, because then in this case, it is difficult, I think, to disassociate Raila Odinga from the politics of Kenya.
Yes, it is.
If we fronted a diplomat who was a pure diplomat, maybe things would be different. I was chatting with a friend of mine and he was telling me maybe we will not even start. We would have lost the election in the first round. But who knows?
Yeah.
It will be diplomat against diplomat, and
Yes.
then we see who has a better vision for AUC. In this case, it was a politician against diplomats. Of course, the other one in Madagascar sadly didn't go far.
Yeah.
But when you look at the dynamics, maybe the countries then settled for someone who better understands the organization. But I think it will not be devoid of the other socio-political factors that then influence elections of these high-level officials.
All right, and we want to go to, for a break, but when we come back, I think we'll be looking into the foreign policy that stands to back us. Should we relook it? All right, with that particular note, we'll be taking a short break, but do stay with us. We'll be back with more, including the diplomatic blunders that actually made Raila lose that particular election. See you on the other side of this break.
Na uso wa jamii. Kupanda shuka, akawa tuzo. Ukakamavu wake, ukatii, na kumfanya mwenye bidii. Kwa machozi na makeke, akabaini jinsi ya kuweni. Huyu ni mwanamke ngangari, kwa jinsi alivyo ng'ari-ng'ari.
Mimi ni mwanamke mwake.
Usikose kutazama kipindi cha mwanamke mwake, nami Caroline Kimwele.
Hi, my name is Stella Tioi.
Jina langu naitwa Okemwa Mokwa James.
This is Mandela Gaya.
Ugonjwa ulipokuja ulichukua siku 3 ukaniweka in coma. 20 wamezikwa, 2 ndio wako hai.
I don't even know how it feels to see.
I feel like I cannot express myself well the way somebody who can walk can actually express themselves.
Ilichukua muda mwingi mrefu tena mpana ili kuikubali kwamba mimi siwezi tembea tena.
I've come to actually accept myself.
Ukijaribu kumsimamisha mtu umwambie tafadhali nionyeshe njia,
They find it quite strange talking to you.
We should just make schools integrated
Inclusive setups.
by providing the right facilities.
Thank you for staying with us. You're watching Low Matters tonight. We are on the tail end of this particular discussion, looking into the AUC election and what happened following the loss of Raila Odinga to clinch the AUC post. Now, Advocate Barasa, when you look into what happened and the analysis in terms of what happened in the continent, there has been the disturbing question that Kenya has lost 2 elections within a 10-year period. When we fielded the former Sports Cabinet Secretary Amina Mohamed in 2017, and now when you're fielding Odinga, when you look into the 2 situations, Is it an issue of where we didn't learn from our past mistakes, or is it an issue of the dynamics that changed when you look into those two elections?
So the first thing that comes to mind is 2017. That is where the Francophone vote became very loud.
Okay.
And that is how Amina lost, because then Chad was able to sway the Francophone vote. But more, the Muslim voting bloc in this continent.
Okay.
And that can also be attributed to this election. When the Organization of Muslim States speaks, it speaks with one voice, and everyone toes the line.
Yeah.
So from the start, if you were to look at it that way, then the Djibouti candidate had quite a bit of head start.
Yeah.
In 2017, it was a bit different, of course. We had a diplomat who has been involved in the international arena in almost all its facets. Amina at the time had served as a permanent secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She had served as ambassador of Kenya to various stations and international organizations. She had become cabinet secretary for foreign affairs in the first term of President Uhuru's administration, and she did a lot of shuttle diplomacy, especially around the question, for example, of the ICC. Should Africa withdraw or not? And she got quite a bit of wins in the AU itself, acquiring a lot of support for what they called mass withdrawal from the ICC. Has that happened? Maybe not, but at least we had resolutions to that effect.
Sure.
So she had credentials under her wings that would have propelled her to be chairperson. But now you start wondering if it is the candidate or the country. I also believe that as a country, we do a lot to support the candidates we propose. Does that give us the results we want at the end is a question we will continue asking. In this case, for example, you had Raila visiting almost 40 capitals in the last few months to just touch base with the foreign affairs ministers and the heads of state to try get their support. But has that resulted in the vote we want? No. We have lost 2 elections in under 10 years. I would say that is a very bad diplomatic record, especially also with just the financial cost that it has come with. To get all these teams moving around the continent doesn't come cheap, right? But how is it that we continue losing this battle? 2 things come to mind. One, how are we getting the candidates we are proposing? Is it in the interest of country or in the interest of the government at play at the time?
Yes.
Someone would argue largely around international organizations. The government of the day would always propose the person, and that applies from the AU to other international organizations within, for example, the UN system. You have organizations who we know it will be Americans as the heads. Of course, it changes depending on the party, but it will still be American. So it is an American interest to secure that position. For Kenya, it's likely what someone called piki ponki. We joke a lot with whoever we select for whatever expediency, right? If we are placing people because we want someone else to take their position, so we front them to a continental job, or for Raila, some were arguing that it is because we want to have the Kenyan election climate as open and as void as possible for the government of the day. I'll give you an example. When Muhisa became the UNCTAD Secretary General, he wasn't a candidate for Kenya. Kenya did not propose him, but he won because he had enough networks as Minister of Finance at the time. And you recall his work around basically development, international development and finance as a minister at the time, and our trade negotiator for a long time within the WTO, that then endeared him, in my view, to the people who would influence policy decisions within governments. And that would then mean for Kenya, an approach will be a bit different from just getting political nominees for these positions to trying to get competence that is grown over time, that we are able to empower strategic people to become the positions we envisage Kenya to occupy at some time. So either you have a young professionals program, for example, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and you get specialities. People specialize in international trade. You get them into the WTO. They can build their profile over time. When it's time for you to pitch as a Director General of the WTO, the possibility is they have enough networks within that community to get that position done. Otherwise, entirely relying on the state, unless you have a lot of financial muscle. We know that, for example, many countries, which we will not name, if they withdraw their budget from an institution, the institution collapses. Yeah. So for them to impose a candidate is very easy. They will say, we want the ED, and the possibility is you get them, mostly the Americans, you'll get them an American ED if they want an ED, right? Because if you don't do that, then the bargaining chip is there's no funding for you, and technically the organization collapses. Yeah. Can Kenya argue that it has that much financial muscle or even international trade muscle to pull its neighbors to its direction without them willingly doing it? Maybe not.
Which actually is unfortunately what, made us to lose that particular election. Yeah. But you earlier mentioned the diplomatic blunders that were there, including the M23 rebels launching here at KICC. When you're looking into the diplomatic blunders, questions were raised whether this was a politically charged sort of campaign or a diplomatic informed sort of campaign. Looking at the two scenarios, and looking at the blunders that have been made, including by the president himself, do you think it was more political than diplomatic in terms of the campaign trend?
You could call it a mix. So we saw the Minister of Foreign Affairs pitching with his colleagues around the continent on the candidature of Raila Odinga, and of course Raila himself talking to their heads of state. The president was very vocal about his support, calling his friends here, especially the neighbors from EAC, to attend the launch of the campaigns for Raila Odinga. He has, every moment he has gotten to visit the continent, he has made the case for Raila Odinga. So it's been a mix, I would say. But more the politics than the diplomacy. I think there has been more politics than the diplomacy, and that then would reflect in the result. Because then we went very heavy politically, and therefore it is difficult to look at politics in isolation. You look at politics, international politics at least, in their totality, so that when the president then goes ahead to speak about his support for example, Israel, without necessarily recognizing the rights of Palestinians, then you have antagonized South Africa, which is in court, in the International Court of Justice, trying to fight for the Palestinian rights.
Even the Muslim countries.
Exactly. And therefore, Egypt is on record at the International Court of Justice, for example, in support of South Africa's case. So you already know that two countries are already out. Muslim countries will not support a state that will not support the Palestinians. Because then their cause is almost the same, right? A cause against oppression. Now, when a neighboring country, DRC, it had just joined the East African the East African community at the time, and then the rebels came and announced here that they will form an alliance right here from Nairobi. It was the first time that an EAC member state was not allowed to go as an election observer in DRC. Just because Kinshasa was very uncomfortable that you would allow on your soil for an alliance against the sovereignty, they called it, or existence of legitimate government in your soil. Of course, the president at the time said that he cannot arrest people because we have laws and we have a constitution that gives certain freedoms to people even when we disagree with their sentiments. But then it leaves a very bad taste in the mouths of those in Kinshasa. And therefore, when time comes for us to pay back, we pay back and pay back heavily. And therefore, that, I think, informs why you would see, while there is tacit support on paper, the hearts of very many people are not necessarily with the Kenyan candidature.
So unfortunate. Now, Advocate Barasa, what then will be the broader implications, or what's next for Kenya, given that particular loss? At a time where people who went to support Raila were singing Bado Mapambano, others saying that we will exit this AU thing, we are not seeing the benefit of this particular union. How will that process be? Is exiting AU as simple as they jacked when they were singing?
If Kenya decides to exit the EU, it can. That is possible. But is that a strategic decision? I think not. Largely because if you want to establish yourself as a hegemony, you establish yourself within a system of nations. So, for example, if Kenya was to say it wanted to be the big guy in East Africa, exiting the EAC works against Kenya, right? It has to stay in the market and establish dominance within the market. Now, in the East African, in the African continent, an argument being made that because they have failed to vote for us, then Kenya has failed to vote for very many of its neighbors, and no one has threatened to leave the AU.
Yeah.
But more, when you look at 1963, when we were forming the OAU, the founding fathers, part of them were Kenyan. The people who came up with the idea of having an continental organization were Kenyans. Subsequently, in 2002, when a decision was made to refurbish and to launch the AU as we know it now, to focus more on development than fight against colonialism, you had a very heavy Kenyan presence, negotiating the text, the constitutive text as we know it of the AU, and subsequent documents that have come out of the AU. So to say that a member state like Kenya would say, because you've lost an election, we would want to walk away from the organization, is it possible? Yes. Is it strategic? No. It is not a good decision. And more, Kenya is a gateway for the East African region. If you want to expand our markets, if you want your SMEs and your banks to expand regionally, you would need to stay within the regional frameworks. One of them being the African Continental Free Trade Area that is established by the AU. And one of the very early players within the Guided Trade Initiative, as we call it, under the African Continental Free Trade Area, is Kenya. Kenya is one of the first countries that exported products under the AfCFTA. So I think we lose more than we would gain if we left the AU or any of the regional bodies that we are part of in the long term.
All right.
Yeah.
And then do you think there would be tension between, Kenya and AU states that have somewhat made Raila lose this particular election, especially when we had some sort of a binding agreement, so to speak, and therefore Kenya will feel that they're on the losing end after using all, the money in the campaign and also the negotiation that were at play. Do you think we might have a retaliatory attack on that?
Maybe not, and largely because in the rules of procedure, we envision a secret ballot. So we might have an idea who voted against us, but it is not black and white. So you can't make a distinct argument that party A did not vote for us, because we don't even know who voted for us, right? It is the hope that the way this candidate or this particular head of state was behaving, possibly they voted for us. But we cannot pin it. But more, you do not want to be, you want the stable nation in Eastern Africa. You provide a safe haven for most of a very turbulent region, right? Do you want to be in any form of antagonism with your neighbors? Maybe not. Further up in the north, you would need a bit of trade to be able to expand your markets. You're struggling, for example, the US market is becoming more difficult for us because we have no idea with the new Trump administration if AGOA, which allows us to export our textile to the US, will continue existing. So you need to be able to relate well with your neighbors to buy your products and replace the markets that either are becoming difficult for you to access or they're just blocking your access completely. Secondly, you need a lot of money to fund a budgetary cut coming from USAID, right? So do you want to fight with your neighbors? You have bigger problems, really. And I don't think your neighbors are any of them.
All right.
Yeah.
Advocate Barasa, I want to make the discussion a bit interactive to allow our guests to ask questions, to field questions. Who will take it away first?
Okay, thank you. My name is Charles Mugeni, and my question would be, you have stated that the exit of Kenya from the AU following after the aftermath of the elections is a possibility but not strategic. So after the elections, Kenyan MP tweeted that he would petition the East Africa withdrawal from AU. So my question would be, is it also a possibility, and if possible, what will be the implications, both legally, since we have an East Africa members, the AUC chair, and also diplomatically?
Thank you so much, Charles. Who will take it away for the second question?
My name is Aneta Kaka, and my question is, seeing that this loss is a setback for Raila Odinga, are there still prospects for him being involved in public service in Kenya and in the continental range?
All right, thank you, Anita, for that. The final question.
Hello, my name is Patience Kamau, and my question is, what policy recommendations were fronted by the candidates of the AUC race that would be deemed substantial in quelling crises and conflicts in the African region?
All right, thank you so much. Advocate Barasa, you have 3 questions there. Kindly answer them because of time within 2 minutes or so.
Okay. ESC membership, that was question 1. If ESC members were to withdraw from the AU, they would withdraw individually as individual states. The withdrawal will not be a block of East African states. And if we couldn't marshal them to vote for us, will we marshal them to leave the AU? I doubt. On the legal framework, again, the East African region and our treaty does not envision where we have a block of regions voting with one vote, right? Every member state has an individual vote, and that will require Kenya to go through the process of withdrawal alone, and then hope that Tanzania, Uganda, and the rest of the East African region countries would do the same. I do not see that happening, especially the grounding reason being that we lost an election. If it was something more substantial, I think that might be a possibility. Public service or any continental role, if you're a Kenyan, you know how versatile Raila can be, so it's a wait and see. I don't think we have heard the last from him. We will hear from him soon. From where that will be, I have no idea. On policy recommendations, so there was a lot of focus on peace and security, and it's largely because you have quite a bit of pockets of war costing the continent billions of shillings, right? If you think about the Eastern DRC, where there is a heavy M23 and other rebel group presence, you have loss of access to minerals, or those minerals going somewhere else other than benefiting the DRC. And just anywhere there is tension, there is no progress, right? There is progress for other economies who benefit from the tension, but not from the citizens who actually live there. So if you think the DRC, or you think up north, the Sahel, where there is a lot of rebel presence, or even West Africa, Burkina Faso, Sierra Leone, which are dealing with a heavy rise of terrorist activity, then security and peace becomes a priority. And why is that an issue? One, it affects trade, right? You cannot move goods and people where people are fighting with guns, right? Secondly, it has an effect on real human lives, women and children especially. You have people who have then to escape and try to find routes. Now, that becomes a burden to the countries that receive them, right? If I'm to leave DRC, that means either I get locked in the fight and die there, or someone else opens the international borders and receives me. If that is the case, you know that African countries, all of them struggle with physical deficits. There is no cash for any extra social spending. So any open door to take in refugees is costly. Kenya, for example, has been a very big example in the region. It has said we do not want refugee camps. One, of course, for security reasons, but also just for the cost. So human conflict, I think, in the continent must shut. One of the things that the continent was envisioning in 2023, and I think the year before, was silencing of guns, and so that the continent can develop without the war. But we haven't seen that happen yet. But hopefully we will in our lifetime.
All right, thank you, Advocate Barasa, for that. Now, coming back to the discussion as we bring it to a close, looking into how the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has handled the issue from the very onset, from the campaign to the very tail end, to what we saw hours before the election started, the PS Singoe saying that, you know, the SADC vote doesn't count much, and, you know, we will definitely win this particular seat. Is there a need to overhaul the foreign policy that we have in the country? Because this particular regime has been on the spotlight for making blunders surrounding foreign issues.
A couple of things come to mind. I think one, the PS Foreign Affairs, having been the lead of the delegation of this campaign, I think should have restrained himself a bit more. The letter might not have meant anything until he spoke. Then it meant a lot, because then you galvanize against a person. That is very possible. But also the practice of SADC over time as intrigued and just protecting their own space they have been very vocal about it. So have we seen blunders? Yes. From the Ministry of Foreign Affairs? Yes. Do we need to overhaul it? Yes. But maybe the overhaul is more a mindset issue and an exercise of restraint than just necessarily changing people.
Policy, yeah.
Because you can change human beings and then you just get the same but in a different body, for example. Yeah. So there has to be, I think, an exercise of diplomacy that is a bit measured. We are an anchor state and a gateway for the East African region, and very many other countries who exist outside the continent look to Kenya for stability and support in very many areas. If you think refugees, if you think displacements, if you think responding to whatever it needs to respond, usually the hub will be Nairobi.
Yeah.
It's a launch pad for very many things, including hosting the regional headquarters of the United Nations. So that means something. It means there is a reputation the country has. But have we utilized that reputation or built on it to advance the cause of the country? I think we haven't. And I think that is also informed by, very sadly, very personal interests of politicians in power, in my view. When your hand is in the cookie jar, it's very difficult for you to speak about the happenings of the cookie jar when you're benefiting from it. If you are involved in some of mining minerals, for example, in some parts of the continent, then you're not necessarily the safest person to speak about peace in that region of the continent. Yeah. And that then complicates how we deal with our internal policy, internal arrangements as a country, and even how we deal externally with other member states of the African Union.
All right. Now, post, what is happening in the country and the implications in the country, now looking into that particular election and Djibouti having it, a country that people have termed a small country, does it have any implications in terms of the tenure of Mohamud in that particular post? Because some have said, given that he's coming from a not so influential country, there might be a struggle here and there, but others have seen that he might have his way around, given that he has worked in many African countries and has his way in terms of diplomatic maneuvers. How do you view it?
I think one of the things that the Constitutive Act provides is his term of office. He has 4 years to work. The election is done. He's legitimately elected according to the rules. He should be supported to work. And I think not showing support for Mahmoud is bad for the continent and a waste of our resources. Sure. Just because he's an occupier of an office created by the Assembly, the constitutive acts of the Union, and therefore I would expect that governments would rally around him to try and advance the causes that he thought was his vision for the continent. Yeah. Are we going to see any tensions? I do not envisage that, because it is hoped that you fight and then a result is announced and then you coalesce yourselves around the result. In this case, I do not think people are fighting against each other. I want to hope that the fight was for the continent. And if the fight was for the continent, there was always a possibility that because there is more than one candidate, any one of them would become chairperson. So the expectation, I think, would be that that chairperson who has been validly elected is supported to deliver on the mandate for the next 4 years. We can always judge after 4 years if he has done a good job or not and replace him, because there's an opportunity for another election after 4 years to select another candidate if we feel he hasn't delivered on his mandate.
And post-analysis, looking into the debates that we had, the three candidates, looking into how they canvass the issue facing the continent, because African Union is supposed to look into, the issues surrounding the continent and looking into how, we can surmount these particular challenges. From where you sit and his diplomatic experience, do you think he's able to chart his way forward?
He has a chance, but it is a position that requires a lot of state government support. There are things that he can't move without states being involved and supportive of his cause. So if governments rise up to support his cause, I think he might deliver some results, but that is entirely dependent on how governments react to his, not just his election, but his tenure generally as a chairperson. But I think he had a very bold vision for Africa, especially on the peace and security front. He has spoken very boldly about Ethiopia and Somalia, tried to come up with a very innovative solution that would quell what would otherwise have been a very escalated conflict, which is unnecessary. He has spoken very courageously about, for example, detention of political leaders in Uganda. He has been very vocal about the war that is going on in Eastern DRC, but he would need a lot of state support. And also, some of the challenges that Africa faces are very multifaceted. It's not a one country approach or one person approach that can solve it. It's more than just what you see. There are players within the continent and players outside the continent that then enable this crisis to continue for long, especially in some of the parts that are very mineral rich. So it will need a continent that is very, that holds itself together, cooperates with the institutions it has established, empowers them to deliver on their mandate, and gives them time to work.
Now, when you talk about state support in terms of, overcoming these particular challenges and hurdles, it comes at a time where we are having the tension that is there in Goma. And, the Eastern African community has somewhat failed to the extent that now President Tshisekedi is looking into SADC states to intervene in this particular situation. So the gentleman is coming at a time where we have pockets of violence in different countries, having an aftermath of coups. We don't have, substantive government, especially in some of the Francophone countries. If it's all about statement support, how then will he be able to navigate this? Are we seeing a situation whereby we might have a crisis? Because Africa is all about interest. Diplomatic issues is all about interest.
Yeah. And I think he has his work cut out. There is so much on his plate. I can't wait to see how his 4 years go and how much he's able to achieve. Apart from just the existing crisis, there is escalation in almost all of them, as we know them. Either, as you've said, in the West, we are seeing governments that did not come to office through election, but are in office. And they have popular support. So how do you deal with that? When you think about Goma, there is a crisis going on. You have a lot of people, thousands displaced. You have a very present escalating war because now M23 has just taken over the second city of Bukavu. That means they continue to extend further into the Congo. It will be interesting to see how his diplomatic skills are applied to try and quell this crisis, especially, for example, for DRC. How do we get M23 and the other rebels to talk to the national government and try work out a solution that would fit? And then there is now the DRC problem with Rwanda as its neighbor. How do we get those two factions to sit down and talk and reduce the escalation that has been there for the longest time? You've spoken about SADC. South African forces have been in DRC for a very long time. And that's why when you talk about DRC, it's an issue that is very extensive and multifaceted. So the South African government, since the times of Thabo Mbeki, has been very involved in trying to settle the problem of Eastern Congo. So it will be interesting to see how the AUC chairperson takes his credentials that have been able to at least temporarily sort out Ethiopia and Somalia and extends to the rest of the continent. But that is a wait and see, I think, scenario for us.
Now, finally, as a country, should we field another candidate in a subsequent election where it is time for the Eastern African, states to field a candidate, or do you think maybe we are not yet of age when it comes to such, sort of contest, given the blunders that we have had and the losses that we have seen so far? Do we give it a break, or what's next for us?
I think Kenya is not short of brilliant people who can serve the continent or even international positions. But there has to be strategic more than just political reasons that motivate our nomination of these candidates. And I'm very certain about the kind of state support our candidates receive. I think they receive a lot of state support. But it's more, is the candidate fit for the moment? Yeah, is the candidate might be very good, but are they fit for the moment? So that when we pitch a winning pitch, and not have, because two fails in less than 10 years is not something to smile about, right? But I do not think that we should shy away from trying if we have the right candidates and we can give them state support.
All right, away from that, because that will take quite a time.
Yes.
This particular loss has bruised our egos, and somewhat we are trying to reshape ourselves to appear as the big brother in the Eastern African community. How then do we, ensure that we stand out and ensure that we come out as the nation we are? Are there any strategies that?
I think for the East African region, first of all, is just to realign with our neighbors. Go back to the drawing board and see where did the rain start beating us. And it has many facets. Among them, just the amount of duty and levies we are charging at our borders, and bullying people to pay them by force. Yeah. And not just Kenyan traders, but even traders across the border. Yeah. And the kind of trade barriers we have set for ourselves, or at least set for our neighbors, from transportation of oil to demanding that they use our standard gauge railway, to demanding that they use the inland port, and other things that would influence our relationship with our neighbors. So I think we need to go back and try heal our wounds, act better. If we want to be the big brother has to be a bit more caring than condescending, and I think we have taken that posture a bit more loudly in the previous years, that we should maybe tone down. Mm-hmm. Relate better with our neighbors, so that at least we know if we fail, we'll fail with the first six. Mm-hmm. At this point, we are not sure who is voting for us and who is not. Mm-hmm. It might be some North African country who has given us a vote, and our neighbor down south has not. Mm-hmm. Which I think is very unfortunate, because then it makes us lose our comparative advantage when we are comparing with the other regions, who at least they start off with the entire block and then look for extra votes. For us, we are not sure if our own neighbors will give us a vote, and therefore that makes it very difficult for us to sail, even just policy-wise, on policy positions that we think are right. We then don't fare very well on the international stage.
And do you think in the election sort of regulations that they have, do you think we are blindsided to the extent that we can never know who's our friend, who's our enemy, given that it's not about the AU at the moment? Sometimes it is a, give and take to some sort of extent. Should we be able to know who's on our side, who's not, once it's all said and done?
Maybe, maybe not. Maybe yes, because it will give us some transparency on if someone tells you they're supporting you, you'll see it at the very end with the numbers. Maybe not, because think about it. If you are to know who did not vote for you, and that person becomes Tanzania, how do you think our relationship will be?
Of course,
it becomes very strained. Yeah. So maybe it's better to keep it secret, and just also secret ballots allow for milder diplomacy without aggression. Okay. Because then you wouldn't necessarily know in certain terms that person A didn't vote for you, but of course you'll get the undertones. But if it's very clear, black and white, then you can easily relate with your neighbors in a very abrasive manner, which Kenya doesn't do very well. It already doesn't do well without an election. Imagine after an election loss.
All right. Yeah. Thanks so much, Advocate Barasa, for that perspective on the AUC elections. It has been quite informative over the last 1 hour. Many thanks.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right. that has been advocated by us, of course, analyzing the AUC election, and from what you've heard, all is not lost from Kenya. You just wake up, dust yourself, and get back on the track. Of course, looking into the issues of diplomatic blunders, refine the diplomatic strategies that we have in the country, and also ensure that we have an amicable relationship with the countries in the African state. My name is Irene Mwangi. Because of time, have yourself a splendid night.